Ukraine has maimed a top Russian general, and petrol prices in Moscow have hit an all-time high as yet another refinery goes up in flames. Kharkiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. And my goodness, there is a lot of news, so much happening on the battlefield and around the negotiating tables in Alaska and Washington. We're starting, though, with news from Kursk, Russian Kursk, where a senior Russian general, indeed the deputy commander of Russia's northern group of forces, was left fighting for his life after a Ukrainian drone hit his convoy some 20 miles inside Russian territory. Lieutenant General Esadullah Abachev has had to have his arm and a leg amputated, according to Russian sources, after that convoy was hit. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because this reminded me of the successes Ukraine had in the early weeks and months of the war. Hard to cast your mind back more than 3.5 years, when it was successfully taking out commanders, colonels, and generals as part of that sort of deliberate decapitation strategy, using Ukraine's strengths, which have always been in this war, its precision and its better intelligence. Because it's not as big as Russia, it has to punch and strike more cleverly than Russia does. And of course, we've seen that continue throughout the conflict, most recently with the deputy head of Russia's Navy also getting hit in a strike in Kursk, and we've seen that against other strikes against headquarters from the occupied Donbass down to Crimea. That came as petrol prices, wholesale petrol prices in Russia, have been soaring. They have topped $1,000 a tonne. This is per tonne, not a litre, not as the way you'd buy it at the pump, but as petrol companies trade it among themselves. The price on the St. Petersburg Mercantile Exchange, $1,023 a tonne this week. Now that price is 55% up since the start of this war. It's 8% up since the start of August, and it is higher than the previous record, which was set in September 2023. And as a result of that, we have seen on social media across Russian news outlets footage of drivers queuing for hours, sometimes up to 8 hours at the petrol pumps to fill their cars. Now, what are the reasons for this? It's a combination of factors. It's not just the war. There is a seasonal spike in demand. That's what I've been reading from experts who understand Russia's sort of fuel economy, domestic fuel economy, much better than I do. It's also because more people in this summer appear to be choosing to drive than to take journeys by road or rail, and that's a consequence of Ukraine's drone strikes against Russian airfields, which have closed airspace, creating huge delays, and, as we've seen, an increase in the number of strikes on Russia's rail network. Now, the strikes on both of those are against Russia's military infrastructure. Particularly, we've seen a recent strike on an oil train, on a cargo train bringing oil towards the front lines, going up in flames, having an effect on Russia's military, having a secondary knock-on effect on the way Russia's citizens, civilians choose to travel. But of course, the main reason, or at least one of the major reasons for this increase in prices, has been Ukraine's successful and sustained campaign of strikes against Russia's oil refinery and oil storage infrastructure. Just most recently, as we're recording this, the Novoshakhtinsk refinery in Rostov, some 200 kilometers from the nearest Ukrainian territory, is currently ablaze. And that is at least the fourth strike this month. On August 14th, we saw a Lukoil site in Volgograd ablaze. On August 11th, a Rosneft refinery in Saratov, and on August the 2nd, at the start of the month, forgive me, this is a difficult one for me to pronounce, Novokuybishevsk refinery. What's interesting is that Ukraine appears to have adapted its tactics, striking these refineries over the course of the conflict. This was a tactic that emerged perhaps a year into it, after Russia had started hitting Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Experts suggesting that these strikes have gone from a fairly scattergun approach, hitting refineries where they could, targets of opportunity, perhaps based on where they could break through electronic warfare and air defences, now being more deliberate and more focused and causing more damage, which means it's harder for Russia to repair it. It means the damage is more serious in the first place, so it has longer lasting consequences. Russia perhaps saw this coming because not for the first time in the war, but on July 28th, a few weeks ago, Moscow banned the exports of refined petroleum products, diesel and petrol, because these shortages were looming. How has Russia responded? Well, Russia has continued throughout this week its nightly bombardments of missiles and drones. And just most recently and controversially, Moscow appears to be deliberately goading America by targeting an electronics factory in the far west of the country, owned by a company called Flex, which is one of the biggest US investments in Ukraine. Now that factory also ablaze still as we record this. And what's perhaps revelatory about this is it undermines Donald Trump's suggestions that US investment in Ukraine would shield it from Russian attacks. You'll remember that when he came into office and he was first talking about ways to broker peace, he was focused on a minerals deal with Ukraine, suggesting that American boots on the ground in terms of miners and extractors and business people and investors would prevent Russia attacking. This strike on the Flex factory in Mukachevo near the border with Hungary suggests otherwise. We have to talk about the peace talks, or rather the meetings between leaders to try and precipitate peace talks, because they have been historic and momentous since our last update. Of course, that started with Vladimir Putin's visit to Anchorage in Alaska. And forgive me for calling Anchorage the capital of Alaska. Many of you in the comments reminded me that's Juneau. Anchorage is the largest city. And that's where Vladimir Putin and his entourage flew in to meet Donald Trump. That was on the Friday. The following Monday, President Zelensky was in the White House for another Oval Office meeting with Donald Trump, which was followed up with a meeting with a number of European leaders, including the leaders of Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Finland, NATO Secretary General and the head of the European Union. What has been achieved? Well, there's been so much talk. There is nothing concrete, but it does appear that perhaps the dials have shifted slightly. We're still in a situation where we're trying to read the runes because nothing really concrete has been agreed. But what did we see? We saw a rather downbeat, an unusually downbeat Donald Trump when he came out of the meeting with President Putin in Alaska. We saw a much more upbeat Donald Trump when he met President Zelensky in the White House, and indeed the whole tone of that meeting far more positive than that awful encounter in February where President Zelensky was shouted down by Trump and his Vice President J.D. Vance. We've had an indication from Donald Trump that America would provide security guarantees. That's massive. Initially, at the start of this year, that was something he said America was not prepared to do. The White House is saying they will not put troops on the ground. That remains the case. But the White House has signaled that the American Air Force could protect Ukraine. We've also got at least 10 nations as part of this organization, this grouping known as the Coalition of the Willing. Some 10 nations have indicated they are willing to put troops on the ground to provide Ukraine security guarantees. But all of that is potentially meaningless because Russia has said it won't accept it. Russia has said it will only accept peacekeepers that are subject to a Russian and a Chinese veto. So that's why I'm saying, in a way, nothing concrete has been agreed. Donald Trump and his Vice President J.D. Vance continue to talk about land swaps and about the need for Ukraine to give up territory. But what's interesting is that during those meetings in the White House, we know that Ukraine and Ukraine's allies, specifically Finland, compared Russia's demands for what it hasn't yet captured of Donetsk to America surrendering Florida and other territories in the South America for the sake of peace. And there's a suggestion that may have resonated with Donald Trump, may have made him realize what he was asking Ukraine to do for the sake of peace. Because one of the things we heard him say was that Ukraine can end the war, Zelensky can end the war, if it simply accepts Russia's demands. But I have to say, and if any of you follow me on Twitter, you know I've said this, that is like telling somebody mid-rape that they can end the rape were they to simply give consent. Because Ukraine has been attacked. It is in the process of defending itself. And what Moscow has asked for is for it to surrender even more land and a raft of other conditions like neutering its armed forces. Now, how has Zelensky responded? Well, in stages, it has been nuanced. Initially, his position was he will not surrender any land. It's unconstitutional. It would be political suicide for him in Ukraine. What he said in an interview just before we recorded this was that things are not as bad on the battlefield as Russia claims. He said Putin has more troops, that's a fact. Russia has more weapons, that's a fact. But he said the economy, Russia's economy is cracking, and that is also a fact. That leads us back to where we started this episode with the damage Ukraine has done to Russia's oil infrastructure, but it also speaks to the pressure Russia is under because of international sanctions and the amount of money that Moscow has had to divert into security and defense in order to sustain the war effort. Zelensky made the point, and this is really important, that it would take Russia 4 more years at the current rate of advance to capture the parts of the Donbass, that's Donetsk and Luhansk, but it's predominantly Donetsk, that it has not yet been able to capture, were it to continue advancing at the current rate. And his point is that we're not going to surrender that. Ukraine is not going to surrender that because it is not about to fall into Russian hands. It is not a done deal. Russia desperately wants it. It's going to have to fight very, very hard for it. Britain's defence intelligence said it would take nearly 4.5 years to get what Russia has yet to capture of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson Oblast. Those are the 4 that Russia has claimed as its own. And the UK said, Britain's Ministry of Defence said, it would cost Russia 1.9 million casualties. That's dead and injured, and that is on top of the 1,060,000 Russian casualties that Britain's defence intelligence estimates Moscow has already suffered. Zelensky insisting that Russia will be out of Sumy, where they have a toehold at the moment, and he said they will not get any of Kharkiv province in any settlement. Reading between the lines there, I think perhaps Zelensky is beginning to prepare his audience, his domestic audience, for the idea, which I think many have come to accept reluctantly, that if there is a peace settlement, land Russia has already captured is unlikely to be handed back to Ukraine. The final thing to mention on those talks is that Trump was very keen to try and arrange a bilateral meeting between President Zelensky and President Putin, and then they said he might then attend a trilateral after that. What we've seen, though, is Russia stalling on that. Zelensky has said he is willing to meet Putin in a neutral third country. Russia responded by suggesting that Zelensky comes to Moscow. That's been flatly rejected. I mean, not least because it would be unsafe for Zelensky to visit hostile territory like that. This appears to be sort of classic Russian negotiating tactics. They've let Trump believe what he wants to believe, but now that it comes down to the nitty-gritty, Putin doesn't want to meet Zelensky because he doesn't want to acknowledge that Zelensky is a sovereign president of a sovereign country and on a sort of same level as him. He doesn't want to give what he sees as the kudos of a one-on-one meeting, the same kudos, of course, that Trump gave Putin with their meeting. And the other thing to mention today is that Ukraine has allowed the cameras into a factory producing its Flamingo missiles. These are a new generation of cruise missiles, which their makers claim have a range of some 3,000 kilometers and can carry a warhead that weighs a ton. They claim they're already producing about 1 a day, and they want to increase that to 8 within months and go into full production by the end of this year. Significant because it's Ukraine's way of saying that it is trying and it is moving towards standing on its own 2 feet as much or more independently from the military aid that it gets from its allies, although that military aid continues to be vital. Thank you as ever for your questions. If you do have any questions, please remember you can ask them in the comments below. Question number 1 is, why didn't Trump arrest Vladimir Putin when he came to Alaska? You know that Vladimir Putin is a wanted war criminal. He's been indicted by the International Criminal Court in The Hague, specifically for his part in the mass abduction of Ukrainian children. And that was a subject which the First Lady, Donald Trump's wife, wrote a letter to Vladimir Putin about. The reason Trump fundamentally didn't arrest Putin was A, because Putin was Trump's guest, and B, because America is not a signatory to the Rome Statute. It does not recognize the authority of the International Criminal Court. But Putin could not travel to many other countries, because he risks arrest. Question number 2. Vladimir Putin didn't get permission, Russia didn't get permission to bring North Korean troops into battle to fight Ukrainian troops in Kursk. So why should Ukraine need Russian permission to get international peacekeepers into its country? It's a very good question. The presence of international peacekeepers will be to enforce and support a peace, to provide Ukraine with security guarantees. If the presence of those troops were so fundamentally Ukraine doesn't and shouldn't need permission. However, there is always a risk that if those troops, particularly from NATO countries, were to go into Ukraine and find themselves in direct conflict with Russia, we've talked about this before, the risk is it spirals into an Article 5 conflict, which leads us into World War III. But I think more importantly, in terms of a peace settlement, you don't want to send troops in which are going to inflame the situation. Their role would be to guarantee and to secure a peace, not to inflame or escalate the conflict. And a slightly loaded question, why don't we tell the truth about how this war started? I was in Ukraine when this war started, and of course you can trace your history back 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years if you want to. But I was in Ukraine in the weeks leading up to this conflict, and I was there the night it started. And it started because Vladimir Putin decided to launch a massive, full-scale invasion of a neighboring sovereign country. Neighboring countries have grievances. I'm not denying that. But this started because of a wanton act of Russian aggression. I think it's very important that we always remember that. Thank you for watching. If you've got any questions, ask them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next time. We're in a Ukrainian armoured vehicle, and we're heading towards the Russian border.